Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Welcome to the next Empowering Every Voice webinar. I would like to introduce the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Life Opportunity Programs and Student Advocate, Cheryl Hamilton, to get us started today.
Thank you so much, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. It is such a delight to see all of you. Thank you for joining us for the second in our Fall 2024 Empowering Every Student Voice webinar. We're very excited about today's webinar. Our focus is on supporting the success of our international students, and I have the honor and privilege of introducing our speaker for today's webinar, Tricia Tierney. Tricia is the International Student and Scholar Services Manager within the Office of Global Affairs at SUNY System Administration. She manages and maintains the SUNY J1 Exchange Visitor Consortium for students and scholars at 30 of our SUNY campuses. Tricia also monitors student and scholar visas and related immigration regulations to advise SUNY campus representatives and SUNY system administration about necessary adjustments to policy and practice pertaining to international students and scholar services. Tricia earned her Master of Education in Counseling and Educational Psychology from the University of Buffalo. She participated in a study abroad program at the University of Warwick and was a volunteer for the U.S. Peace Corps in Morocco. How interesting. Tricia has worked in higher education with experience in both student affairs and international student and scholar services. Tricia is a member of NAFSPA, and she serves on the Association of International Educators Region 10 leadership team, where she coordinates federal government agency presentations. Tricia has personally presented case studies for J1 scholars and ongoing orientation for international freshmen. It's my pleasure to present to you our dear friend and colleague, Tricia Tierney.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. I'm really glad to be here today talking to all of you. International students are very near and dear to my heart. It took me a while to figure out what I was going to say, how to bring it down in size, because I have a lot to say. I've been doing this since the early 1990s when we were doing it in 3-part triplicate forms where, you pressed and it wrote through on the paper below. So I have a really soft spot for international students. Prior to coming here to System, I've been here for about a year and a half. I was at the University at Albany where I worked with international students. And I've also worked with them at some small private liberal arts colleges, which has been really interesting because it's, two very different ends of the spectrum. One where I'm the only person at the institution who knows much about international students, to the other where, there's a whole office dedicated to it. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from today. We're going to talk a little bit about just some basic statistics and stuff to sort of put things in perspective, and then we'll talk more about actually working with international students. So I just want to just start by defining international students. So when your ISS office or the folks on your campus that work directly with international students are talking about international students, they're usually talking about an F1 or a J1. Those are some visa categories that are defined by the Department of State. F1 meaning a student, and like a degree-seeking student, and J1 is usually more like an exchange student. And so that's often what they're talking about, and that your institution has very direct and specific responsibilities for. Your institution, actually, if you have F1 students, then you've applied for it and you have very specific reporting and other responsibilities for those F1 and J1 students. Your campus probably has other students who are in other non-immigrant visa categories. So you might have someone who's and on an employment visa, an H visa, and they might be taking classes, or you might have somebody who's the sibling or child of somebody on an H1 visa, so that then, or a government visa or an embassy visa, right? So those are all other what we would call non-immigrant visas. And a lot of your international offices will also provide cultural support to them, but won't do any or shouldn't be doing any actual advising on the visa status, on the actual visa category. When I'm giving you numbers about international students, it's both of those categories. It's both F1 and J1, and then H and other miscellaneous non-immigrant statuses. It does not include students who are in immigrant or what we would consider immigrant intent statuses. So these are students who are already maybe permanent residents or on their way to permanent residence. So they might be refugees who are applying. They might be DACA. They might be undocumented students. So most of the time, your ISS office is not is having minimal interaction with those students. Some offices I know have more support for do more support for their DACA and refugee students. But as far as actual like advising on regulations, that would really only be your F and J students. So wanted to just give you a little picture. This is throughout the SUNY system of where our international students are and how the numbers go. So sort of a high point was back in fall of 2014. And you can see the COVID dip, and we're coming back. We don't have stats yet for fall of 2024. My understanding is that it's from the campuses is that it is, there has been an increase again at most of our campuses. As you can see, most of the students are at the doctoral degree granting institutions, the vast majority. When you're looking at the community colleges, you should note that that little top kind of lighter blue. That actually includes FIT, which is technically a community college, but also has some master's degree programs. And probably about half of that little blue at the top is FIT, just alone within it. So that does kind of skew it a little bit. So this is fairly regular, I would, in most other, the national statistics are pretty much the same across the country. So we're not really off the national statistics by very much. Everyone always asks this question, and so I put it up there, and you can sort of find your campus quick. They are divided by sectors. So around SUNY, about 5.8% of our students are international students. But then you can see the doctoral degree granting institutions, that's much higher, and then the technology colleges, the comprehensive colleges, and the community colleges. So people often want to know, where does my institution land? So gives you an idea. So we have students, or last fall, we had students from 184 different countries at SUNY. So sometimes it can be really hard to talk generally about international students when you think about the idea that they're coming from 184 different cultures, 184 different countries. So that is sort of, that does make a lot of conversations about specific needs or specific cultural behaviors a lot harder. That said, there are a few countries that are our top sending countries, and your campus might also have top sending countries that could also help you sort of understand where things are coming from on your campus a bit more. So from this past fall, India was the top. One of the other interesting things is that I like to point out when I'm talking about international students is undergraduate versus graduate, right? So if we go back to the the picture before where we were talking about, oh, it's the doctoral degree granting institutions. That's because a lot of the international students are actually at the graduate level, not at the undergraduate level. And so that kind of, then of course, that's how they end up at FIT with a master's degree or at one of the doctoral degree granting institutions. One of the things that happened actually post-COVID or during COVID was for years, China, the red one, had been our top sending. Lots of Chinese students year in and year out for a long time. Actually, China was the top sending school. And actually, when it was China, there was a more even number of graduate and undergraduate students, right? If I go back one slide, you can see that's still even true for China, right? China's about 50-50 grad and undergrad. But now when we're talking India, right? So in 2021, 2022, it switched and India actually became the top sending institution, which then also means more graduate students than undergraduate students started to be our greatest population. So that was a big change on a lot of campuses, and it actually created some changes in numbers as as to where people are going now, what institutions they're going to. Oops, sorry, I want to go this direction. So one of the other things that it changed was it changed what we see on our campus. And that's a big cultural change, right? From India being top and the most students to China, and China, right? Some switches there. And so some of you and some of the people on your campuses are probably feeling that switch and maybe don't even realize it. But when you talk about culture, we're going to talk a little bit about culture. I won't get too deep into it, but there's sort of the things that we all sort of see and enjoy a lot of times: arts, crafts, music, language, right? Those are the surface things. The food, who doesn't, you always like to try it at least, so we all love the food. And those are the observable things, and the things that we often revel in. But then when we sort of talk about culture, then we really talk a little bit more about sort of the deep culture or the non-observable things, attitudes, communication styles. And these are things that sometimes in pressure situations, or in quieter ways, become a concern. They can become a concern for a faculty member who isn't getting what they want out of a student, or thinks that someone's done cheating, or different things that you're like, oh well, how do we think about the idea of body language or eye contact in a classroom, right? So when we were talking a lot about Chinese students, primarily Chinese students, there was, we used to talk to faculty members about, don't be surprised if you're not getting a lot of eye contact at first. Indian students are very different. You definitely will get eye contact. One of the things that Indian students do is they shake their head no, and they mean yes. Right. And so for you as an American professor or presenter at the front of the classroom, you're like, because I've done this, you're watching and you're like, oh goodness, they're not understanding what I'm saying to them. Right. I'm trying to explain some point of law and they're shaking their head and I'm like, oh, so now I go on and on. Right. So some of these things, but then others. So how do you ask for help? Or how do you not ask for help? How do you work as a group? How do you do things together as a group? And so is group doing homework as a group, is that acceptable in your culture or not acceptable in a culture? So these are some of the things that when you're facing an international student and you're thinking, what is happening here, right? This doesn't make any sense. We might need to think about culture on a deeper level, on sort of a more what's cooperation versus competition, right? America can be very competitive, and cooperation really can fall to the wayside a lot in America, and so then, but cooperation in China would be quite high. And so students coming up with the same homework wouldn't be unusual, right? So some things to sort of think about there when we're talking about that switch to which is the most popular culture and what are the cultures on your campus? What are the countries that your students are coming from? And what does that sort of, what are some of the cultural things that they bring with them? So we're going to talk really the rest of the time about what we can do and what we need to know for supporting international students on our campus. I talked a little bit about the Department of Homeland Security and some compliance and advising, campus-wide understanding, including like supportive policies, supportive programs, and then some areas to just sort of be aware of. I'm not expecting anyone, and I'm hoping no one would come out of this saying, oh, now I know everything there is about F1 students and I'm going to advise them. Please no. I still am learning things like new, and things are still changing on a regular basis. But there are areas that I sort of want you to be like, oh, that's something I know they need to talk to the ISS office. So we'll start actually just by talking about staffing. So staffing and funding to recruit students, and their recruiting is different, right? The recruiting process, the recruiting times. You know, I remember doing like 6 o'clock in the morning sessions, live sessions, because that's when it works for students that are overseas. And the process is a lot longer. International students start earlier because they actually have to go through a whole process with the Department of State to get their visa. And they stick with the institution. They stay attached to the institution longer because they get a work authorization that lasts from 1 to 3 years. And so they're still tied to the institution. So the DSO at your institution is still talking to your students 1 to 3 years later, is still having to communicate with them. So that's a really sort of like longer than you would think of for your regular US student. Sort of down a level, each campus has to have a principal designated school official, a PDSO, and should have at least one designated school official. So those are the people that have been approved by the Department of Homeland Security to advising students on F1 visas. The PDSO has different responsibilities and can see different things and do different things than the DSO. But if your PDSO goes away, you need to have a DSO as a backup. The PDSO is required, or your institution, to do some reporting to the Department of Homeland Security. There's reporting that happens at least weekly. At some institutions, it's every day. So that's simple things like changes of address, changes of phone numbers, changes of major, right? All of those things get reported to the Department of Homeland Security. And then there's by semester. Every semester, your international office has to say, yes, these students are here again. They are registered students again. And that's every single student, every single semester that you have to go in and they have to go in and sort of say, yep, this student is here and is doing what they're doing. So there's a lot of reporting. And then when a student moves into some employment situations, there's reporting that needs to happen on reporting situations. I won't get into more details than that. So then it's sort of what needs to be provided to support these people. So really, I think the biggest thing is professional training for staff in both the admissions and the ISS side of things. So on the admissions side of it, they're looking at transcripts that are from other countries, and they actually really need, it can get really in depth and really confusing. So is a 3-year program from India the same as a 4-year bachelor's degree here when you're looking at admission to a master's degree program, right? So we're getting into like really in-depth things. So those people in your admissions office, they have to have what's an international baccalaureate degree versus, a high school diploma. in different countries. So there needs to be training. Obviously, there needs to be training on all of the federal regulations, and there needs to be ongoing support because you're just, the DSO is forever presented with questions that are just hard to answer sometimes. Specific situations that are hard. So, ongoing training and in federal regulations, educational systems, advising practices, and cross-cultural understanding. We, when we were feeling this switch going from Chinese students to Indian students, we really sort of had to take a time out and sort of be like, okay, now let's think about what does this mean? What are some of the features of Indian culture that might be different than the features of US culture that we're now seeing some stress within offices. We're seeing some stress within systems because it's different. So, taking that time out. And they need to have access, your staff, your DSO staff, your admission staff, they really do need to have access to support organizations and support resources to help with some of those questions. So one of the things that I do is I do meet every 2 to 3 weeks with staff on campuses. We do a Zoom call. It's coffee hour. ISS staff, your DSOs, sometimes it's admissions folks, to talk about cases, to talk about new situations. Because when you're the only person on your campus who really understands international students, it can be a little rough to sort of manage that, particularly the case situation. So we do meet on a regular basis, and I talk with DSOs at different campuses. I'll talk with 2 or 3 DSOs a day about different situations. So they have some support within SUNY, but they also need to have support within their community. If you're at a small school, what's the big school in the area that might be seeing other things? And national organizations, the National Association for Foreign Student Advisors, NAFSA, is one. ACRO is another, that's for admissions. So make sure that the folks on your campus are getting that kind of support. So sort of back up for a second. Ooh, I just lost my lights. One thing about when you're talking about international students is, and you're trying to support them, is knowing who on your campus is the ISS person or is the DSO is really important, because I can tell you what the regulations were at UAlbany and how they were interpreted at UAlbany. And that was actually different than how they were interpreted at the College of Worcester, and how they might be interpreted at different places. And so, there is always that need to go back to the person on your campus who's responsible for it, particularly when it comes to what I'll talk about later, which are some of the areas of concern for international students. So depending on the size of your international population, sometimes some of this is kind of obvious, and then other times it's not. But across campus, actually, international students can really affect some other offices and other offices other than your ISS office or your DSO. Need to actually have some familiarity with basic F1 regulations because of the way it impacts the work that they're doing. So human resources because of employment regulations, the registrar's office because of regulations related to how many classes a student's taking. Obvious academic advising, when you're talking with the student about what their classes will look like for the next semester or about dropping a class this semester. There's some really important things that academic advisors need to know. And faculty, particularly when you're talking at the graduate level and they're having, closer relationships. Faculty and international students are often having closer relationships. Then faculty need to be aware of some of the basics so that by mistake, they're not advising a student to do something that would be against their status. So that's sort of one level, sort of the highest level of people outside of ISS that really need to have some familiarity with the regulations. And then there's sort of the next level down, which is some policies and procedures that sort of need to recognize the international students' needs. For example, Residence Life. I just saw a post from a campus, not one of our campuses, thank goodness, that was saying they close for 2 weeks over winter break and their students have no place to live. Well, that's a really rough thing. Like, just think about your child or your favorite niece or nephew, and they're going to school somewhere else. And now wherever they're living is saying to them, oh, we're closing because that's convenient for us. And now you have to go somewhere else. So now you don't have a place to live. You don't have food. Your transportation changes, right? So when you have international students on campus, Residence Life needs to be thinking about that and thinking about coming early and staying late, because flights to China, flights to Egypt, right? Like, they don't happen easily all the time. It doesn't always jive as well with getting in your car or getting your parents here to pick you up at the right time. Financial services has to deal a lot. Some countries internationally, getting money out of that country can be very hard. Limits on the amount, limits on the way in which funds can be brought over. So there's, from a financial services office, there's a lot that can happen with the international students. Health services and health insurance. The SUNY system has a brokered insurance policy that all international students other than at the community colleges, some of the community colleges participate, but not all of them. Otherwise, all international students have to have health insurance. And they have to participate either in the SUNY health insurance, or if they're a GA or a TA, they might have insurance through that position, and would be waived out of the SUNY student health insurance. But the expectation is that they all are going to have, it's a pretty comprehensive health insurance, fairly similar to what we as employees of the SUNY system have. And that's really important because their insurances from home hardly ever work here. And additionally, as you all know, our insurance system is very cumbersome. It's not at all what they're used to. And the process of getting medical care can be very different. So health services and health insurance are another area that really need to recognize that international students are coming with different. This isn't a really quick antidote, but when I was at UAlbany, we were moving to really make sure that students had their MMRs. And all of our Indian students kept getting kicked back that they didn't have it. And they kept saying, yes, I have 2 doses. This is just the stupidest little thing. I have 2 doses. And we kept saying, well, the health service office isn't approving it. We found out the problem was that in the US, the time when you get your first dose and between that and the second dose was different in the US than it is for India. Right. And so their timing is different. And so these students kept getting pushed off that, no, you don't have the 2. So then, adjustments needed to be made, things needed to be said to Indian students differently to understand this process. But so they all did have 2 doses. It just wasn't within the same guidelines of the US system. So another area that often you'll find is student conduct. I was referring to it a little bit before about maybe cheating and what's considered cheating or copying. Even before we started to talk about AI, right? Prior to even AI, there was a lot of conversation with international students about doing your own work versus doing work as a group, or finding the work online. So a lot of that around student conduct, or ways in which personal relationships are okay. Maybe what in the US we might see as an abusive relationship in another country might not be considered that as an abusive relationship, particularly, an intimate relationship. And so some of those things kind of rear their head in student conduct. Programs and services that makes international students feel more welcome. They can do things to really welcome the international students on your campus. Career services. A lot of international students are here to get their degree, but they also want experience, right? The experience that they can bring home is really big. It makes a huge difference on their resume. So career services, resume reviews, talking with students about interview prep. Interviews are really culturally bound experiences. And so whatever your career services can do to sort of help them with the interview prep. Food services, international nights, making sure that there's halal or vegetarian food regularly, right? Kosher food regularly, sort of knowing your international population and making sure that the food service is responding to that. And then a lot of times international offices work with food services to just for special events, say International Student Week, and okay, now we're going to do special menus. So tutoring services, English as a second language sometimes. So international students do have to have a certain level of English. An F1 or a J1 student has to have a certain level of English in order to be admitted to your institution. Great. Yep, that's good. That doesn't always, though, translate into writing a great paper or feeling confident talking in front of people. And so, tutoring that deals with some of the language differences would be a first. And then other tutoring, they come from a very different educational background. So some of the areas say psychology and sociology, they won't have the knowledge that a US student would have in psychology and sociology, because again, those are culturally bound areas. So they might need more tutoring in that area than a regular, your average US student might not need that. And of course, student activities, student organizations, student government, all of those things can make a student feel more welcome. An international student, make them feel more welcome on campus. Some supportive policies and programs that a campus should be thinking about. A dedicated recruitment plan to actually boost your number of international students, because it is a really different process as an international student to get from looking at colleges in the US to actually getting here. And it has extra steps that need to be considered. Clear and accessible applications. And this was really particular for China. So like China can't use Google Forms. There's multiple apps that students couldn't download onto their phones. And in some other countries, there might be other apps. So you need to sort of be aware of where you're recruiting and is what you're putting out there for the students accessible to them. Pre-arrival information that's specific to international students, just like orientation needs to have specific parts of it that are specific to international students. And in both of those things, some of the things that we talk about, obviously we talk about the immigration regulations, the do's and the don'ts, we talk with them at length about those things, but then you'll also want to talk about how is the US classroom different than the classroom that you're used to at home, right? Orientation is often a time for international students to get over jet lag. We're taking them to Target or to Walmart or to the grocery store, things that US students in New York State will bring them with them. Our international students, we actually go to the grocery store or actually go to Walmart and help them get those things. So depending on where you are, your office might actually even be taking a trip like a farther distance to get them there. So that was transportation before, during, and after the semester. It can be really difficult depending on where your students are on campus versus off campus. One of our campuses has had to talk with international students about, yeah, I know you want to live off campus, but living off campus then probably means you need a car. So, some of these conversations need to happen even during the pre-arrival. And of course, getting people to and from the airport. I remember when I was at a small college in Ohio, vans full of students driving them to Cleveland because there was no other way to get them to Cleveland. So the staff at the institution actually drove students to the airport. Whereas here in Albany, they can get their own ride to and from the airport. Religious support. Religion is a really interesting subject. Many of our international students come from countries where religion is much more ingrained in their culture. It's a part of their culture in a more basic way than it is in the US. And so religious support is something that they are expecting that maybe isn't there for that US students might not be asking for. And so it might be something that the Student Affairs Office or the ISS office or the Multicultural Office needs to be getting a pulse of. Are students feeling supported in their religious in their religion? So something just to sort of be aware of, because US students might not be asking for it. Intentionally created connections to campus communities. International students won't necessarily create their own because systems overseas are not necessarily that way. So if any of you have studied abroad in Europe, you'll know that no, student activities and student affairs and student life doesn't happen that same way overseas as it does in the US. So students aren't coming knowing that they need to make those connections themselves. They're expecting to just, go to campus, take classes, leave campus, and campus connections aren't there. But of course, we all know the greater the connection to campus, the more successful the student is. So sometimes there need to be intentionally created connections. Someone asked me once, what was the thing that a campus can do for international students? On-campus jobs is probably one of the things more international students say that they're looking for than anything else. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. And then open discussions about acts of harassment, exclusion, ways in which they feel excluded that people don't realize. Nobody means it when they might, some of the exclusive stuff, say food, say housing, you can feel excluded by a policy. Classes that are being dropped because the student hasn't been able to get the money out of their home country. So differences of opinion. So open discussions on those, they can be really hard. But when you find that the same thing is coming up over and over, then you know that you need to have a systematic talk on whatever that act of exclusion, right, is. And then home country clubs, new organizations. One of the client campuses was having a cricket. They were having intramural cricket. Hey, that's fun, right? And that certainly makes a student feel like they're welcome where they are. This is a little smaller than I'd hoped it was, but it would be. But so some of the subjects that you sort of need to be aware of when you're working with international students that are very much policy related are they need to be full-time enrolled all the time. Each semester, they need to be a full-time enrolled student. So for most of our undergrads, that's 12 credits. Different campuses have different definitions of full-time enrollment for graduate students. So obviously you need to know that. There is a limit, and this is becoming a huge problem. There is a limit for the number of fully online classes that an international student can take. So that would be a fully online class. On some classes and some campuses, it's a high flex class. It's not usually a hybrid class because a hybrid class normally includes some time in person in the classroom. But there's a whole policy about online classes. That is something that as a person talking with a student about their academic advising or that you're having stress, maybe dropping a class, those different situations. You need to be aware. Also, as you're developing new programs on your campuses, programs that have a high online class focus become a big problem for international students. And there's employment limitations. So I mentioned on-campus jobs are something that international students are really looking for because that's what they can do. They can work on campus. They can work for your university. They can work for your food service. they can work for your institution, but they can't go off campus and get a job easily. Sometimes they can do an internship, right? A very focused internship related to their field of study. After graduation, they can get work authorization to do work in their field of study. But as a student, while they're there, an on-campus job is really the best way for them to learn about U.S. work environment, to meet other people that are on campus, have connections to campus, and to earn a little bit of money. The one thing that I would say is to check with your ISS office or the DSO on the campus, or have the student check with the ISS office. Student comes to you and they're talking about an internship. It sounds interesting, sounds good, right? But I need you to talk with the ISS office. Very next thing, right? That's the next thing you have to do, is talk with somebody about, can you do this, or how can you do this? Those kind of things. So definitely, those are some high policy areas. There's others, there's pages and pages, but those are some of the ones that we find most often international students get. Awareness about cultural differences, right? Classroom cultural differences can really for a first semester, second semester student, can be very stark. Conversations in classes, discussion in classes, in some of the cultures is not something you would do at all. I mean, a Chinese student wouldn't really have sort of an open discussion like we would in a political science class here, right? That wouldn't happen. And so to get them, to bring them out, we talk with that about that. So it's not unusual for faculty members to have concerns about international students in their classrooms. And then considering sort of the process of cultural transition. Students normally come in pretty excited, a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks, maybe only 2 or 3, pretty excited to be here. Then sort of the reality of the situation starts hitting. And we talk about the cultural curve. And so, then they sort of start to get down. It can go all the way down to just straight out depression, right? Really in-depth homesickness and depression. And then typically by the end of the semester, students have sort of come out of that and are, okay, I'm feeling a little better about being here. But unfortunately, those things sometimes line up with midterm exams or midterm break, and now there's no one around, and I'm feeling depressed, and there's no one around, and I have a lot of studies to do, right? So the cultural transition process can really tie into academic success and just personal success being here. There's also a lot of personal awareness that we as people working with international students need to have. We need to work on our cross-cultural competence, on our understanding where we come from in the US, and then also what does that mean relative to other cultures? And sort of thinking about that, reading about that, going to workshops on that. I mean, I know we all don't love those things, but there's a reason that they're out there, because it does help us remember and help us think about that. Communication with international students. When English is not the first language, we in the international office at UAlbany, we would really work sort of on presenting things in multiple ways. So not only spoken, but also written. Not only written, but maybe a video that they can go back and look at again and again, right? Because now if you're in your first semester here and you're just getting used to listening to English, and maybe American English versus British English that you were taught, depending where you're coming from, the resources that you can give a student to go back and look at something that's being said in writing or listen to it again can be really important for that student to eventually comprehend what's being said to them. And then learning about your culture and learning about their culture, it can also really be helpful. So this is my last slide, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So just sort of a wrap up. Campus-wide support is really vital to international students. Yep, the ISS office or your DSO is there and has specific responsibilities. And some other offices on campus also, are there to meet specific needs. But really across campus, people need to sort of have that awareness of, oh, this is an international student. And so let's think about this a little bit differently. Let's try to come at this from a different perspective. Integrated programs are needed that connect your international students to other students, right? And to other campuses, other campus resources. Whatever we can do to every step of the way connect that international student to campus is a further success for that student. It particularly with language barriers, it's so easy to not be connected, right? It's much easier to go home and back to your room and talk with your roommate who speaks French with you and not connect with the other students in the US who are speaking English. And so then the connection just comes further and further. So programs that really kind of pull international students in time and again. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to open it up to questions. If you want to write a question in the chat, you can. I will be sharing these slides and they will be then shared with you. And there's some connections on that last piece, that last page that I shared with you, or the second to last page. There were some connections for cultural competence and understanding US culture. So I'll start with one of the questions that just popped up in the chat. And does SUNY offer any sort of translation or interpretation services for students who may not be comfortable communicating in their native language? And there is not a system-wide process for that. Most of our students have to come with unless they're in an English language program in particular, they have to come with a basic language abilities. And so most campuses really sort of rely on that idea. Now, when you're talking some situations, say, let's say a medical situation, or let's say a financial situation, that can be a little harder. The medical situation, you want to talk with your campus, and there are actually medical interpreters, language interpreters that are medical interpreters, because that gets really complicated. I can say we had times that we brought in international students or faculty members to try to communicate with students or with students' parents, sort of using the resources that you have on campus. But no, there is not a centralized resource. So how does SUNY or a SUNY affiliated school collaborate with third parties in recruitment and support of international students? So two different things. So recruitment, there actually is a system. Different campuses do it different ways, but so remember, we're sort of going back to the culture of where these students are coming from. So in China in particular, but also in South Korea, in Taiwan, and to a certain degree in India, those students and their families would be looking to we'll say, a consultant or a recruiter that their family, so the student's family hooks up with this person, and that's sort of how it's done in their culture. So then the SUNY systems, often SUNY colleges, not the system as much as each different institution will actually might have we call them agents, is actually the term that we use. So they might have agents that they work with in different countries to then say, okay, this is learn more about SUNY Binghamton, and this is about SUNY Binghamton. And that agent then knows enough about SUNY Binghamton that they could present SUNY Binghamton as an option for the students in that country. So different countries have different agents and different agent situations, right? So in Europe, agents don't really, it's not really such a big thing. Not like it would be in China in particular. So it depends on the country that you're talking about. And it is also an institution-based thing. Some institutions really, so agents can be time consuming, right? You're developing relationships. There's a lot to happen. So some of our schools don't really want to work with agents. So they work with other smaller organizations or other organizations. Study New York is one of them that a lot of our institutions work with. And so Study New York, instead of working with specific agents, sort of works as a group to bring New York State institutions worldwide. I hope that answered your question. Good. And here's the thing that I often, I just came back actually from a NAFSA conference, and it's always really interesting to talk about SUNY because we are so broad, right? From community colleges to our R1 research institutions. And so it's very hard to talk, like, not only am I talking about students from 184 different countries, but I'm also talking about them going to a huge variety of institutions that are very much their own institution, right? So when you might talk with folks at CUNY, there's a for their international students, it's a bit more brought together within the CUNY system. The advising, the academic advising happens more centrally. The F1 advising, I'm sorry, not the academic advising, the F1 regulation advising happens more centrally. That's not true, right? Recruitment does not happen centrally at all in the SUNY system, right? So it's a really interesting place to talk about because we're way out there. I mean, we've got it all. Music schools and art schools, which then that brings up lots of different employment issues, right? So you're doing a gig, you're doing like a one-night gig versus you've got a job at X place. Very different employment situations. So next question in the chat. So can students from the US who are going to study abroad choose to live outside of the college campus where they are going? So I have done study abroad stuff in my past. It is not my area of expertise anymore. But I do know that it depends completely on the program. So some programs, depending. So when you're studying abroad, you're choosing to go on a particular program, right? Sometimes it's to a university at another place, right? An actual, I studied abroad at the University of Warwick in Warwick, England, right? And that was a regular British university. We had housing on campus and we all lived on campus because that was the expectation of that program. Sometimes it will be like a small institute. So a lot of our students that might be going to Italy might be at an institute because you're not going to end up at an Italian university because you'd have to have enough Italian to be at an Italian university. And so the housing will really change, will really vary depending on the actual program that a student is looking at. And if living on campus or not on campus is important to a student, that would actually be one of the things that the student should be looking at when they're looking at the program, right? Or in a host family situation, right? So if a student's wanting to pick up language, if language acquisition is a big focus for that student, then a host family situation might really actually even be better for them than off campus or on campus. So it is for study abroad, for US students going abroad, those are all things that they sort of, when they're thinking about going abroad, okay, so this is what I want to do. What do I want to get out of it? And then there's over 400 study abroad programs within the SUNY system. So normally you can sort of find something that works and kind of clicks many, if not all, of the check boxes. How are we doing on time? 4 minutes.
I was gonna say we have a couple more minutes, and Cheryl had a question in there that might kind of wrap everything up. How can student affairs staff and international student services staff collaborate to facilitate the transition of new international students, particularly in their first semester?
Sure. Oh, and just also, Jen did put the webinar feedback in there for you guys. If you can please take that, I'd appreciate that. So how can you facilitate? So facilitation needs to sort of start with the pre-arrival information, like once a student is accepted, and what's the information that they're getting university-wide, and does that university information then translate well for how it works for an international student? For example, that question, that scenario that I brought up with you about MMR. So really looking at your processes, your onboarding processes, and how do they work for an international student, and then orientation. How are you integrating international students with other orientation, but also pulling them out to get the information that they need, right? Just like all other clubs and organizations, student organizations right now, getting students to be involved in things is hard. Students do not want to be involved, right? It's not, and it's not just in the international side, it's across the board. But we do find that when you bring them in with their country organization, so the Indian Student Association or the International Student Association, and you get that group to kind of work with them. So, that's how on the ISS side, how we're making things happen. But as far as like actually sort of on a more intentional level between international services and student affairs, I would say number one is to look at the processes and how are the processes working both ways. Like, what are we saying about arriving early? And if you arrive early, like we had to purposefully switch to saying you need to find a hotel room, and saying that straight up front, like, I understand you might arrive early, but you're going to need to find a hotel room, and here are some suggestions, right? Because it just couldn't work for the Res Life staff. And you didn't really want to say that to them, but in the end, we just couldn't come up with somebody else. So number one would be saying some of those processes are number one, and then advising, working with your advisors, your academic advisors, because those are often the people, or if you have a freshman seminar program or whatever you call it on your campus, right? Those are really top places to make sure that the international office and advising or freshman program have connected, that there's been a presentation from ISS to advising services or to the freshman seminar faculty to say, to really get into really in depth, which I didn't. What are the differences between the classroom in the US and the classroom in other places, right? I didn't get into that with you guys, but there's lots of presentations about it. So that would be some of the places that I would say are really good places to connect. Does that make sense, Cheryl?
Yes, this was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. And
yeah, thank you, Tricia, for mentioning the evaluation. We are going to fix that for folks. Just a little glitch in the evaluation. That link will be available in the recording link. So if you could go ahead and do that evaluation when you get that in a few days, we'd appreciate it.
Great.
Tricia, thank you so much for the presentation. This was incredibly informative. We might invite you back. This was great. And Jen, thank you for
Great.
all your work.
Well, and I was also, I'm just, so there's some other questions in there on study abroad. And I was thinking we might want to invite some of my colleagues who know more about study abroad than me to come and talk about that because they might be able to answer some of those questions in more detail. I did just put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to email me. You're very welcome to email me if you have questions. I would, though, honestly say to get in touch with the DSO or the ISS office on your campus, because I'll answer some questions generally, but I'm going to end up referring you to your campus's ISS or ISS office or DSO, because it is different. Policies and procedures are different campus to campus. You're welcome. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks,
Enjoy
everyone.
the sunshine. Yay.